All right, so now we're going to go on to part B of the same problem, where it's asking us to construct and interpret a 95% confidence interval for the difference in proportion of men and women who support Obama in this city. So again, you want to make sure that you're doing part A first, or else a lot of this will kind of seem very confusing to you. All right, so we're going to start off with our first part of our confidence interval, which is our point estimates. And our point estimate, remember, is that first value that's going to be in front of the plus or minus sign. Now with the two proportion test, we're going to take our proportion from our first sample, so P1 minus P2. Okay, and in this context of the problem, is going to be 48% of men who said they support Obama and 55% of women who said they support Obama. So we subtract those, and that comes down to the negative 0.07, which we had that same value in our significance test, which means that 7% more women supported Obama, or you can think about the opposite way, 7% less men supported Obama. Then we move on to our next part of our confidence interval. And remember, this whole part right here, that's our margin of error. There we go. Margin of error. And the first part of that is our critical z-score, which is right here. Remember, the way that we get that is we first look at what level of confidence we have. We have a 95% confidence interval. So we're going to put 95% in the center, which means that we have 2.5% left over in the tails. And then we use inverse norm and plug in 0.025 to get us our critical z-score of 1.960. So this is how you get that value. You should be very familiar with it by this point. If you're having trouble, again, ask those people at your table, and I'm sure somebody will be able to help you out with getting that value. So then the next part is we have our standard deviation, which in a confidence interval is also called our standard error. So we're going to call it our standard error for the rest of this problem. So we use that same formula that we use for our significance test, except we're going to be using P1 and the P2 values from our sample. So unlike the significance test where we combined both our sample results, we're going to use the separate samples in our two different values that are listed right there. So for this first part, that's dealing with P1, the sample proportion from the men in our study. So we do the sample proportion, which was 0.48, and then 1 minus that, which is 0.52, divided by our sample size for the men, and that's how we get those three numbers. Then to the right of that, we have our numbers from our second sample proportion, which is P2, and we get our proportion of women who supported Obama, which is 0.55, 1 minus that, which is 0.45, and then divided by our sample size, which is 240. So that's how you get all those numbers and plug them into the formula. Then you just go down here. I would suggest simplifying out the standard error, the standard deviation, and writing this out because it's a lot of calculations. So just to simplify a little bit, do that first before multiplying it by the critical z-score. Those should have been your values. If you have the right numbers plugged in, you're not coming up with those values. Again, check with your partners at your table and help each other out to make sure you guys are putting it into your calculators correctly. Then we multiply our critical the z-score with our standard error, which gives us the 0.0884, which remember is our margin. Oops. Margin of error. I don't know why that's popping up. There we go. So then we subtract that, and our edges of our confidence interval is going to be negative 0.1584 and 0.0184. So now this is important. We take the time to think about how we interpret these values. So if we have a negative value, since the men were first and the women were second, that means that the women had a higher value if it comes out to be negative. If it's positive, that means the men had a higher value. So the way that we can interpret this confidence interval, we can say we are 95% confident that the true difference in proportion of men and women who support Obama is between the women being 15.84% higher. That's what we get from this number right here. And men being 1.84% higher. You get that from this other boundary. So remember, anytime we go from a negative to a positive, you're going to be switching between the two different groups. And going back to our significance test, since 0 is included in our confidence interval, we're not going to have convincing evidence that there is a difference between the two different genders. If 0 is not included in our confidence interval, then we would have statistically significant evidence that there is a difference. But since 0 is included in our confidence interval, that means that we can't say there is statistically significant difference between the men and women proportions, which lines up to what we found previously in our significance test.